Welcome, dear listeners. I have prepared a mysterious story for you. 30 years of revenge behind buried identities. Before we begin, please write in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. This motivates me. Now, relax. The story begins. Chapter 1. What the River Brought. It was the last week of October, and London had awakened, as usual, under a grey blanket. The fog hanging over the Thames River in the early morning hours was like a giant shroud trying to cover all the city's sins. Workers at Limehouse Dock were already sweating, even before the sun had risen. Cranes creaked, ropes tightened and slackened, and crates were carried ashore from the ships, one after another. Thomas Brennan was an old worker who had spent 30 years at this dock. That morning, he had arrived at work before dawn, as usual. Without even having breakfast, he walked towards the riverbank, rubbing his hands together to warm them. It was a habit he had developed over the years to see what kind of debris the tide had washed up on the shore during the night. Sometimes valuable things were found, a fallen watch, a lost umbrella, even once a small pouch filled with gold. But what he found that morning would haunt Thomas Brennan's dreams for the rest of his life. The body, half buried in the muddy shore, looked at first glance like a routine drowning case. Dozens of people lost their lives in the river in London every week. Some accidents, some suicides, others silent victims of murder. But when Thomas approached the body, he felt his stomach churn. The man's throat had been slit from ear to ear. "My God," muttered the old labourer, staggering backward. Within 2 hours, the scene was swarming with Scotland Yard officers. Inspector Lestrade stood looking at the body, his hands in his coat pockets, his brow furrowed. The police officers around him were taking notes, gathering witness statements. But Lestrade's mind was elsewhere. "Has the identity been confirmed?" he asked the sergeant beside him. "Yes, sir. According to the documents in his pocket, his name is Samuel Harker, 45 years old, dock worker, lived in the Docklands area." Lestrade shook his head. "Looks like a routine murder, probably a fight, maybe a robbery." "Sir, there's something else." The sergeant lifted the corpse's right hand with his gloved hand. Lestrade's eyes widened. On the man's little finger was a magnificent ring that caught the sunlight. It was gold, but not ordinary gold. It was engraved with an intricate coat of arms. A hawk holding an oak branch in its talons. It was the kind of jewel a dock worker couldn't earn in 100 years. "What's this?" Lestrade muttered. "There's more, sir." The sergeant opened the corpse's left palm. The fingers were tightly clenched in rigor mortis, and it took some force to pry them open. Inside was a wet, crumpled piece of paper. He clutched this tightly until his death. There's something written on it, but it looks like an indecipherable code. Lestrade looked at the paper. Indeed, the symbols and letters on it made no sense. The seemingly random arrangement of characters was perhaps the product of an indecipherable ramble. Or perhaps... "Hopkins," called Lestrade. "Send a man to Baker Street. Find Mr. Holmes and tell him to come here immediately. Tell him we have something interesting." Sherlock Holmes was watching the streets of London from the window of his flat at 221B Baker Street. Behind him, Dr. John Watson was settled in his comfortable armchair, reading the morning paper. The fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the room with a pleasant warmth. "Another murder," said Watson, without looking up from the paper. "A tailor has been murdered in Whitechapel. The police are looking for suspects." Holmes shrugged. "Commonplace. Probably an old customer over an unpaid debt." How can you be so sure? Holmes turned from the source window. His eyes shone with their usual sharp gleam. The paper says the tailor was 56 and had been running his shop for 40 years. A tradesman who stays in business that long makes more friends than enemies. But as he gets older, his eyesight fails. The quality of his work declines. Old customers complain but remain loyal. New customers, however, refuse to pay when they don't like the quality. Such disagreements sometimes turn violent. Watson shook his head. What about the knife wounds on his face? The newspaper says his face was unrecognizable. A sign of rage. The killer knew the victim and harbored deep resentment toward him. Targeting the face is a sign of personal revenge. A professional killer does a clean and quick job. This is a passionate murder. Watson folded his newspaper. Sometimes I wonder how your mind works, Holmes. Don't worry, Watson. Just observe and think. Anyone can do that. But most people prefer to ignore what they see. Just then there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson, the landlady, opened it, and a young police officer entered. He was out of breath, as if he had run all the way. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade wants to see you, sir. A body has been found at Limehouse Dock. The inspector says this is no ordinary case." Holmes's eyes lit up. Details. A dock worker found on the riverbank with his throat cut, but he has a very expensive ring on his finger and a coded note in his palm. Holmes turned to Watson. "Have you finished breakfast?" Watson stood up. "No, but I suppose it can wait." "Then get dressed. London awaits us." By the time they reached Limehouse Dock, the sun was already high, but fog still hung over the river. Lestrade met them at the scene. He had a worried look on his face. "Holmes, it's good you're here. This case, it's baffling me." "Tell me about it," said Holmes, walking towards the body. Lestrade described Samuel Harker's identity, the ring, and the coded note. Holmes listened without interrupting. When they reached the body, he knelt down and began to examine it carefully. "Watson, what do you see?" The doctor leaned forward. "Male between 40 and 50 years old. His throat was cut with a sharp instrument, probably a razor or a butcher's knife. The cut is clean and deep, made in a single stroke. The killer is either a professional or someone familiar with anatomy. Anything else?" Watson examined the corpse's hands. "The hands, interesting. Too clean for a dock worker. There are calluses, but in the wrong places. This man's hands aren't used to lifting heavy loads." Holmes smiled. "Excellent, Watson. Now look at the fingertips." Watson carefully examined the corpse's fingers. His eyes widened. "Ink stains, under the nails, even between the fingerprints. And these calluses—" He paused. "These are calluses from holding thin paper for long periods. Not the hands of a dock worker, but of someone who writes or types. This man wasn't a dock worker, Watson." Holmes stood up and turned to Lestrade. "The name Samuel Harker is probably fake. This man has spent most of his life with a pen or printing type. Someone is hiding who he is, or he has given up being himself." Lestrade frowned. "What do you mean?" "Let's look at the ring." Holmes examined the ring on his finger carefully. The gold was bright and the workmanship was perfect. The crest on it, an eagle clutching an oak branch in its talons, whispered something to him. "This crest, it looks familiar." Holmes turned the ring thoughtfully. "Lestrade, I want to find out who this ring belongs to. But first, let's look at the coded paper." Lestrade handed him the paper. It was wet and crumpled, but the writing was still legible. Holmes held the paper up to the light. At first glance it looks like random characters. But if you look closely, there's a certain pattern. It's not a Caesar, cipher, something more complex. Perhaps a book code or a personal code. Watson looked over his shoulder. Can you crack it? In time, Watson. Every cipher has a key. Finding the key is just a matter of time and patience. Holmes put the paper in his pocket. Lestrade, send the body to St. Bartholomew's. I know a pathologist there, Dr. Edmund Croft. Tell him to look especially for traces of poison. Poison? The man was killed by having his throat cut, Holmes. Yes, but why was he clutching the paper so tightly? He didn't let go even at the moment of death. Either he was in shock or part of his body was paralyzed. Some poisons can cause that effect. Lestrade nodded. Understood. Anything else? Holmes took a few steps toward the river. He was examining the muddy bank. Who found the body? An old labourer named Thomas Brennan. He's waiting over there. Holmes walked over to the old man. Thomas Brennan sat in front of a hut, his hands trembling. There was a cup of tea beside him, but he hadn't touched it. Mr. Brennan, Holmes said gently, I apologize for disturbing you, but I need to ask you a few questions. The old man looked up. His eyes were red. What do you want to know? When you found the body, was anyone else around? No, sir. It was very early. The other workers hadn't arrived yet. Well, did you see any boats or rowboats near where you found the body? Thomas thought. Now that you mention it, yes, sir. A little further on, under the pier, there was a small boat, but it was empty. Do you recognize the boat? No, sir. It wasn't one of our harbour boats. It had a different paint job, dark green. Holmes smiled. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You've been very helpful. He turned to Watson. A dark green boat. Fishermen in this area usually use blue or brown boats. Dark green is the favourite colour of smugglers in East London. It's invisible on the river in the dark of night. So the killer was a smuggler? Or someone using a smuggler's boat. Either way, they needed a vehicle to dump the victim in the river. This was a premeditated murder. Holmes looked around. Limehouse Dock was one of London's darkest corners. It was a place where goods from all corners of the empire flowed, and not all of them were legal. Opium, bootleg liquor, stolen jewels. It all passed through these docks. Watson, why was this man killed here? Why not somewhere else? Watson shrugged. Maybe it was a familiar place. Maybe he was used to meeting here. Or the killer wanted to link him to this area. Killing him as a dock worker is the perfect cover to hide his identity. Holmes took a deep breath. Come on, Watson, we have work to do. When they returned to Baker Street, Holmes placed the ring and the coded paper on his desk. He began examining the ring with his magnifying glass. Watson, have you ever heard of the Moran family? Watson thought. No, it doesn't ring a bell. Neither can I, but this crest, I must have seen it somewhere. Holmes turned to his bookcase and pulled out a dusty volume. Burke's Peerage, a record of England's noble families. His eyes stopped at a certain point as he browsed through the pages. Here it is. The Moran family, a small aristocratic family from Essex. They made their fortune trading with the East India Company. He paused. But here's the interesting part. The last member of the family, George Moran, died in 1865. According to official records, the family ended at that time. 1865. That's almost 30 years ago. Yes, Watson. And this ring is that family's signet ring. It should have been buried with the last member of the family. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. So why is this ring on the finger of a dock worker, or someone who looks like a dock worker? Watson sat up in his chair. Maybe he stole it? From the grave, 30 years later, Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, there's a simpler explanation. Either George Moran never died, or this ring somehow came into circulation after his death. How do we find out? Holmes smiled. It's time for a visit to the cemetery. But first, we need to decipher this coded note. He sat down at his desk and placed the paper in front of him. He examined the characters one by one. Watson stood behind him, watching with curiosity. I see that some characters are repeated. And here, this could be a date. November 7th, 1865. Holmes frowned. 1865, the year George Moran died. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences, Watson. The rest of the cipher. Holmes looked closer. The letters are jumbled, but there's a pattern. If I assume it's a simple transposition cipher. He picked up a pen and began calculating. Minutes passed. Watson waited silently. Finally, Holmes looked up. His face wore an expression of triumph. I've solved it, Watson. The message reads, Highgate, November 7th, 1865, GM. Highgate. The cemetery? Highgate Cemetery. One of London's oldest and most magnificent cemeteries. Many famous people are buried there. Holmes stood up. And GM, George Moran. Watson's eyes widened. So this paper is about George Moran's grave? It seems so. And the victim kept this information with him until his death. Holmes picked up his coat. We're going to Highgate tomorrow morning, Watson. But first, we have a few more things to do. What kind of things? Visiting Samuel Harker's house in the Docklands. And... Holmes paused. I was told the victim had a sister, a seamstress named Agnes Moran. Moran? Why is her maiden name different? Holmes smiled. That, Watson, is one of the questions we must answer. As evening fell, Holmes and Watson walked through the narrow streets of Whitechapel. This area was one of the poorest and most dangerous parts of London. 7 years. Earlier, Jack the Ripper's terror had swept through these streets. Even now, when darkness fell, people shut themselves in their homes, and the streets fell silent. Agnes Moran's dressmaker's shop was on the ground floor of a small, neglected building. A few faded dresses were displayed in the window. Holmes knocked on the door. The woman who opened it was about 40, with a pale face and tired eyes. Her hands were calloused from years of sewing. Yes, she said in a suspicious voice. Mrs. Moran, I'm Sherlock Holmes, and this is my friend Dr. Watson. We'd like to talk about your brother, Samuel Harker. The woman's face paled. Come in, she whispered. The shop was small and dark. There were bolts of fabric, needles and spools of thread everywhere. Agnes led them to the back room, the small section where she lived. Samuel? Is he really dead? She asked, her voice filled with both fear and something else. Perhaps relief. Yes, unfortunately. He was found this morning on the banks of the Thames. Holmes watched the woman closely. Was he your brother? Agnes hesitated. Yes, sort of. Sort of? The woman took a deep breath. Mr. Holmes, I must confess something to you. Samuel wasn't my real brother. We grew up together in the same orphanage. Years ago, when we were young, we started calling each other brother. Since then, we've been like family. Holmes nodded. Well, what do you know about Samuel's real past? Agnes bowed her head. Very little. Samuel didn't like to talk about his past. All I know is that he once had a different life. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he would wake up with nightmares. It's burning, he would mutter. Everything is burning. Watson leaned forward. Burning? What was burning? I don't know. He wouldn't answer when I asked. Agnes wiped her eyes. Samuel was a good man, Mr. Holmes, but he was running from something. He was always looking, over his shoulder as if someone were following him. Holmes stood up and began examining the room. On a shelf, an old sewing box caught his eye. May I take a look at that? Agnes hesitated, but then nodded. Holmes opened the box. Inside were threads, needles, buttons. But at the bottom of the box, something glinted beneath the fabric. Holmes pulled it out. It was a metal mould, like a printing type, but larger and more intricate. A name was engraved on it, but backwards. What is this? Asked Watson. Holmes held the mould up to the light. A printing mould, used to make forged documents. He turned to Agnes. Miss Moran, what is this doing in the box? The woman's face turned pale. I don't know. I found it while sorting through Samuel's belongings. I didn't understand what it was. Holmes put the plate in his pocket. I see. Now, have you ever heard the name Victor Hale? Agnes's eyes widened. At that moment, Holmes knew he was getting closer to the truth. Yes, the woman whispered. An old friend of Samuel's, but they hadn't seen each other in years. At least, I thought so. Where does Victor Hale live? I don't know. He disappeared years ago. Everyone thought he was dead. Holmes nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Moran. I'll be back if I have any more questions. As they left the shop, Watson asked, What do you think? Holmes looked out into the dark streets. I think, Watson, that this is no simple murder. This is the final page of a 30-year-old story, and we are only reading the first sentence. The fog enveloped them as if to swallow them whole. The dark heart of London was determined to guard its secrets. Chapter 2. False Names. The next morning, Holmes and Watson set off for Highgate Cemetery. The cold October wind made the yellowed leaves dance among the gravestones. The sky was covered with a leaden blanket, and the first scent of the approaching winter was in the air. Highgate was one of London's oldest and most magnificent cemeteries. Wealthy Victorian families had chosen to lay their dead to rest here, among ornate tombs and statues. Despite years of neglect, the imposing angel statues, ivy-covered columns, and moss-covered gravestones still looked majestic, greeting visitors like ghosts from another era. The cemetery keeper was an old, hunchbacked man. He scratched his head when Holmes asked about the Moran family grave. Moran? The name sounds familiar. They must have been a big family back in the day, but no one comes here anymore. He looked at a dusty notebook. Here, West Canada, Section 7. Old section, among the vines. Holmes thanked him, and with Watson, walked deeper into the cemetery. The path became increasingly neglected and eerie. Tombstones were tilted, some toppled over. Vines covered everything as if nature were trying to reclaim the dead. Finally, they reached the Moran family plot. It was a small family cemetery, enclosed by iron railings, crowned by a marble monument. On the monument was engraved the same crest they had seen on the corpse's finger the previous day, an eagle clutching an oak branch in its talons. Holmes opened the railings. The gate creaked open and stepped inside. He read the gravestones one by one. Here, he said at last, George Moran, 1820-1865. Watson approached the gravestone. He was only 45. How did he die? Holmes read the inscription beneath the stone. Answered God's call. Very vague. Usually indicates illness or accident. Well, is it possible to open the grave? Holmes looked thoughtfully at the grave. Getting official permission would take weeks, but... He looked around. There's no night watchman in the cemetery, and this section is far from the main paths. Watson frowned. Holmes, grave robbing is illegal. True, Watson. But to solve a murder, one must sometimes walk the edge of the law. There was a familiar gleam in Holmes's eyes. We'll return tonight. Bring a shovel and a lantern. That night, shortly after 11 o'clock, Holmes and Watson quietly entered Highgate Cemetery. The moon peeked through the clouds occasionally, casting a shadowy light on the gravestones. Both were dressed in dark clothes. Watson held a lantern. Holmes carried 2 shovels over his shoulder. When they reached the Moran family plot, Holmes dimmed the lantern's wick. We must work quietly. The guardhouse is far from here, but you know how sound carries at night? Watson nodded and they set to work digging. The soil had softened with years of moisture, but it was still hard work. Hours passed. Sweat dripped from their foreheads, their arms ached. But finally, one of the shovels struck a wooden surface. A coffin, Holmes said breathlessly. They cleaned the coffin lid and broke the lock. Holmes took a deep breath and opened the lid. The coffin was empty. Watson looked inside in astonishment. This is impossible. It should have been buried here for 30 years. Holmes shone his lantern inside the coffin. The velvet lining had faded and decayed over time, but there were no bones, no remains inside. Only in the corner a small piece of metal glinted. Holmes picked it up. It was a button, bronze, engraved with a small anchor motif. "A sailor's button," said Holmes. "Probably fell off the coat of the person who closed the coffin." He put the button in his pocket. "Watson, this grave never held a body. George Moran did not die in 1865. He disappeared. And someone staged a fake funeral for him." "But why? Why would you stage your own death?" "Good question." Holmes climbed out of the grave and began smoothing the earth around him. People usually stage their own deaths for 2 reasons. Either they're running from someone or something. Debts, crimes, enemies. He paused. Or perhaps they want to start a new life. They restored the grave to its original state as best they could and quietly left the cemetery. By the time dawn broke and they returned to Baker Street, both were tired, but their minds were racing. "Holmes," said Watson, collapsing by the fireplace. "If George Moran didn't die in 1865 and lived on as Samuel Harker, then who killed him? And why now, 30 years later?" Holmes lit his pipe and took a deep breath. The date on the coded paper, November 7th, 1865. That's the date George Moran died. The killer murdered the victim by reminding him of this date. This is no coincidence, Watson. It's a message. A message to whom? Perhaps to us, perhaps to someone else. Holmes watched the smoke, thoughtfully. But first we must finish the story of this ring. And we must find Victor Hale. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson went to the old printing district in Limehouse. At the turn of the century, this was the centre of London's printed publications, newspapers, books, brochures. All were produced in these dark workshops. But now, the area was like a ghost town, with its abandoned buildings and crumbling walls. Finding Victor Hale's old printing shop wasn't difficult. Holmes had stopped at a local pub and obtained the information with a few shillings worth of tips. The printing shop was a 3-story brick building at the end of a narrow street. Its windows were boarded up, its door sealed with a rusty padlock. "It looks like no one has been in here for years," said Watson. Holmes examined the lock. "On the contrary, Watson, This lock is old, but there are grease marks. Someone comes here regularly. He took a steel wire from his pocket and began to pick the lock. Within seconds it opened. Inside it was dark and dusty. The air was thick with the musty smell of years and old ink. Holmes lit his lantern. The ground floor was filled with old printing presses. Huge printing presses, typesetting tables, letter cases, all covered in dust, like relics forgotten by time. Holmes walked among the machines, examining everything carefully. "Watson, look over here." On the table, unlike everything else, was a clean notebook. Holmes opened it. "This is a record book." He turned the pages. Dates, names, numbers, but the names are coded, a mixture of letters and numbers. Watson looked over his shoulder. "What kind of record is this?" "My guess, false identity records." Holmes pointed to a page. "Look, it says JW, AK, 1867. Probably someone switching from an old identity to a new one. And here's the amount paid, £150. That's a small fortune for that period." So this printing shop was the centre of an operation producing fake identities. It seems so. And our victim, Samuel Harker, or George Moran, was probably one of the founders of this operation. Holmes put the notebook in his pocket. This notebook could threaten many people. Perhaps the killer murdered to prevent these secrets from coming out. They went upstairs. This must have been the living area, an old bed, a broken wardrobe, faded curtains. But one thing caught their attention, a picture frame on the wall. Holmes took the picture. He dusted it off. "Interesting," he said. There were 3 men in the picture, young, probably in their 20s. The first, tall and handsome, looked confidently at the camera. The second, shorter and stockier, had a nervous gleam in his eyes. The third— "This man," said Holmes, pointing to the third, "resembles the corpse. Of course, he's 30 years younger." "So this is George Moran." "Most likely. And the other 2? Victor Hale and perhaps a third partner." Watson turned the picture over. There was a note written in pencil, "GM VH EC 1863. New beginnings." "EC," said Holmes thoughtfully. "Those initials ring a bell." "Ring a bell? How so?" Holmes thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. "Dr. Edmund Croft, the pathologist at St. Bartholomew's, the man I asked to examine the body." Watson's face paled. "Holmes, if that's true, could Dr. Croft be connected to this operation? Perhaps he was connected to his father. E.C., not Edmund Croft. Perhaps his father. He was a young man in 1863 and worked with the other 2. Holmes put the document in his pocket. "We need to go to St. Bartholomew's, Watson. Urgently." St. Bartholomew's Hospital was one of London's oldest and most respected medical institutions. Located in the Holborn district, with its imposing stone buildings and spacious courtyards, it was a living monument to the history of medicine. Watson had trained here, and the corridors reminded him of days gone by. Dr. Edmund Croft's office was in the pathology department at the rear wing of the hospital. When they knocked on the door, a weary voice came from inside. "Come in." Dr. Croft was a man in his 50s, bespectacled and pale-skinned. Papers, bottles, and medical instruments lay scattered on his desk. He stood up when he saw Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, I was expecting you. Your autopsy report is ready." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Doctor. But first, I need to ask you a few questions." A flicker of unease crossed Dr. Croft's eyes, but he quickly hid it. "Of course, go ahead." Holmes sat down in the chair opposite the desk. "Doctor, what can you tell me about your father?" The question caught Dr. Croft off guard. My father, why is that important? Just curious. Are you from a medical family? Dr. Croft hesitated. Yes, my father was a doctor too. He spent most of his life working in the East End among the poor. He passed away 10 years ago. Where was he working in the 1860s? The doctor's face paled. Mr. Holmes, I don't understand where these questions are leading. Holmes took a photograph out of his pocket and placed it on the table. Do you recognize this photograph? Dr. Croft looked at the photograph. His hands began to tremble. There was a long silence. This, he said finally, his voice low. Where did this come from? From Victor Hale's old printing shop. There are 3 initials on the back. GM, VH, EC. The last 2 are your father's initials, aren't they? Dr. Croft closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. Mr. Holmes, I must confess something to you. But you must promise that what I say will not leave this room. Holmes nodded. I promise, as long as justice is not compromised, of course. The doctor stood up and walked to the window. My father was a good man, but he made mistakes in his youth. In the 1860s, there was a huge wave of immigration to London. People were coming from Ireland, Europe, even India. Most were poor. Most were desperate. He turned and looked at Holmes. My father and his friends, George Moran and Victor Hale, saw an opportunity. They sold people new identities, new names, new documents, new lives. Watson leaned forward. A fake identity operation. Yes, my father would arrange the death certificates. George would do the typesetting and printing. Victor would find the customers and collect the money. Dr. Croft turned back to his desk and sat down. They worked like this for years. They became rich. But then, something went wrong. What happened? Asked Holmes. In 1865, George Moran disappeared. Officially, he was dead. But my father told me the truth. George ran away. I don't know why he ran, but my father was afraid. Victor Hale also disappeared some time later. My father realized he couldn't run the operation alone and shut everything down. Holmes asked, thoughtfully, Did your father ever say why George Moran ran away? Dr. Croft shook his head. Only once on his deathbed he muttered. Fire, he said. Everything is burning. May God forgive us. I never understood what he meant. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. Fire. The word Agnes Moran had also mentioned. Doctor, said Holmes, now would you tell me about the autopsy report? Dr. Croft seemed relieved. The subject had changed. He took a file from his desk. Samuel Harker, or whoever he was, died definitively from having his throat cut. But I found something interesting. He opened the file. There is a trace amount of an alkaloid in his blood. It's hard to identify, but I think it's a curare-like substance. It has a paralyzing effect. Watson frowned. So the victim was paralyzed before his throat was cut? Probably. That explains why he was clutching the paper so tightly. The muscles were contracted by the poison and didn't relax. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Doctor. You've been very helpful. He walked to the door but turned back. One more thing. Do you know where Victor Hale is? Dr. Croft shook his head. No. No one has seen him for years. Everyone assumes he's dead. Everyone thinks so, said Holmes with a mysterious smile. But someone is still coming and going in this printing shop. The lock is regularly oiled. A look of surprise appeared on Dr. Croft's face, but Holmes left the room without saying anything more. Outside, Watson asked, Holmes, do you trust Dr. Croft? Holmes walked thoughtfully. Halfway. He told us the truth, but not the whole truth. His father's story is probably true, but I think Dr. Croft knows more. Like what? He might know why George Moran ran away. And maybe... Holmes paused. Maybe he even suspects who the killer is. But why wouldn't he say so? Fear, Watson, or complicity? Holmes pointed to a carriage. Now we must go elsewhere. To Whitechapel, to Martha Stride's bar. Martha Stride's bar was a small, dark tavern called the Anchor and Hope. In the heart of Whitechapel, on a narrow street, it was a dilapidated building that seemed to have been there for centuries. When they entered through the door, they were greeted by smoke-filled air and the smell of beer. The woman standing behind the bar counter was over 40, with harsh features but an unexpected spark of intelligence in her eyes. Her black hair was pulled back, and even as she wiped glasses, her hands seemed alert. "What will you have?" she asked, giving Holmes and Watson a suspicious look. "Information," said Holmes, "about Samuel Harker." The woman's hands paused for a moment. "I don't know Samuel." "Really? We heard he was drinking here the night before he died." Martha Stride leaned over the counter. "Who said that?" "The streets have ears, Mrs. Stride, and I am a man who knows how to talk to those ears." Holmes smiled slightly. "I also know that Victor Hale is your lover, and that he is still in London." The woman's face froze for a moment, then she shrugged. "What do you really want?" "Just the truth. Who killed Samuel Harker?" Martha stared at Holmes for a long moment. Then she opened the door behind her and gestured inside. "Come in, but just the two of you." The back room was a small, warm living space. A fire burned in the fireplace. Old photographs hung on the walls. Martha sat them down and placed a bottle of whiskey on the table. "Victor isn't here," she said, "but I'll send word to him. He'll want to talk to you." "Why are you so sure?" Martha took a deep breath. "Because Victor is afraid too. He's been hiding since Samuel was killed. Someone is hunting them, Mr. Holmes. George, Victor, maybe even Dr. Croft. All of them. Who's hunting them? I don't know, but Victor mentioned a name." Martha lowered her voice. "Aldous Kincaid." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Who is this Aldous Kincaid?" "A wealthy businessman. Years ago he was a client of George and Victor's. He's taken on a new identity." Martha took a sip from her glass. "But Victor says the real Aldous Kincaid is long dead. The man using that name now is a ghost." Watson leaned forward. "So this Kincaid is using a false identity?" "Yes. And now he's silencing everyone who knows the truth." Martha stood up. "You can meet Victor here tomorrow night. But be careful, Mr. Holmes. This man is dangerous." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Stride. We'll be here tomorrow night." As they left the bar, Watson asked, "Holmes, we need to investigate this Aldous Kincaid." "Yes, Watson, but first, let's try to solve this notebook." Holmes took the notebook from his pocket. "It says J.W., A.K. here. If Martha is right, J.W. is Aldous Kincaid's real identity, and we need to find the owner of those initials. As night fell, London's foggy streets swallowed them up." Holmes's mind was racing to solve the puzzle. When they returned to Baker Street, Holmes spent the entire night poring over the notebook. Watson had fallen asleep, but Holmes's lamp burned until dawn. When Watson awoke with the first light of morning, he found Holmes at his desk, his eyes red, but his face wearing an expression of triumph. "I've solved it, Watson. I've discovered who J.W. is." "Who?" Holmes pointed to a page in his notebook. "James Whitfield. In 1867, he acquired a false identity, Aldous Kincaid." Looking at the details, the real Kincaid came from a wealthy merchant family, but was unmarried, and his family had fallen on hard times. James Whitfield bought his identity and has been living under that name ever since. So who is James Whitfield? Holmes took a deep breath. That, Watson, is the answer that will lead us to the real murderer. And I fear the answer is far darker than we imagined. Chapter 3. The Dead Speak Holmes. Spent that morning researching. Watson knew this state of his friend well, his eyes shining, fingers constantly taking notes, his mind working like a machine. The sitting room on Baker Street was filled with papers, maps, and newspaper clippings. "Watson," Holmes said in the afternoon, lifting his head from the papers, "I've found some interesting things about James Whitfield." Watson sat up in his chair. "Tell me." "There is no one named James Whitfield before 1867, at least in the official records. It's as if he came out of nowhere." Holmes handed him a newspaper clipping. "But in 1866, there is a report about a ship returning from India. The ship's name was Eastern Star. Among the passengers were several British soldiers and one civilian. His name is unknown, but witnesses describe him as a young man with burn marks on his hands." Watson read the clipping. Burn marks. Agnes Moran also mentioned Samuel's nightmares. "Everything is burning," he would mutter. "Yes, Watson, and Dr. Croft's father said the same thing." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. In 1865 or 66, there was a fire in India. This fire caused George Moran to flee and probably led to James Whitfield, or whoever he was, coming to London. So what was this fire? An accident? Holmes turned. His face was serious. "I don't think so, Watson. I think it was planned, and George Moran played a part in it. Perhaps he was an accomplice." Watson's face paled. "So our victim was actually a criminal?" "Perhaps, or perhaps he was a witness. Either way, this fire from 30 years ago is the key to the current murders." Holmes picked up his coat. "We need to go to the India office. I want to examine the records from 1865-66. The India office was a magnificent building in Westminster. Here, hundreds of years of records relating to the British Empire's activities in India were stored. With the help of a familiar clerk, Holmes gained access to the archives. 1865, India, fire," Holmes muttered, rummaging through dusty files. "It must be somewhere." Hours passed. Watson sat beside him, reading the documents Holmes had found. Most were mundane administrative records, tax collections, land distributions, trade figures. But finally, Holmes found a file. "Here it is," he said, holding his breath. The file was titled Bengal Region Insurgency Suppression Operation, December 1865. Holmes opened the file and began to read. His face grew paler with every line. "My God, Watson, this is a massacre." Watson leaned over the file. According to the reports, a small village in Bengal, a region under the control of the East India Company, had been burned down on charges of rebellion. The entire village, men, women, children, had been locked in their homes and set on fire. According to the official report, this was a necessary measure to suppress the rebels. But there was an additional note added in handwriting. Operation responsible, Lieutenant George M., Sergeant Victor H., and Company Dr. Edward C. George M. Victor H., Edward C., Watson read. George Moran, Victor Hale, and Edmund Croft's father. Yes, Holmes's voice was ice cold. They burned a village, Watson. They killed hundreds of innocent people, And then they returned to England, set up a fake identity operation, and carried on living as if nothing had happened. Watson closed the file. His stomach churned. And now someone is taking revenge on them. It seems so. James Whitfield, if that's his real name, is probably a survivor from that village. The burn marks. He must have escaped through the fire that night. Holmes took a deep breath. He waited 30 years, Watson. 30 years of planning, preparing, and finally acting. But why now? Why after 30 years? Holmes thought. Perhaps there was a trigger. Perhaps George Moran recognized him, or he recognized George, or perhaps Whitfield was waiting for the right moment to complete his revenge. Watson stood up. Dr. Croft is in danger. We must warn him. Yes, Watson, but first we need more information. Holmes put the file in his pocket. Tonight we'll meet Victor Hale. He can tell us the rest of the story. That night, Holmes and Watson returned to the Anchor and Hope pub in Whitechapel. Martha Stride was waiting for them in the back room. Beside her was a man with a faded face and trembling hands, Victor Hale. Victor must once have been a healthy man, but now he looked much older than his years. His hair was grey, his eyes were sunken and dark, and his hands trembled constantly. 30 years of fear were etched on his face. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a trembling voice, "Martha told me about you. You're investigating George's death." "Yes, Mr. Hale, and I believe I know why he was killed." Holmes sat down opposite him. "Bengal, 1865, a village." Victor's face turned pale. How did you find out?" "The India Office archives. Everything is recorded, Mr. Hale. Everything." Victor closed his eyes. There was a long silence. Then he began to speak, his voice just above a whisper. "That night, that cursed night, everything changed." He opened his eyes, but his gaze was distant, 30 years in the past. "We were young, foolish, and ambitious. We had gone to India to make money. We worked for the East India Company. George was a lieutenant, I was a sergeant, Edward was a doctor." "What happened to the village?" asked Watson. Victor swallowed. "The village didn't revolt. That was a lie. There was a man there, a local zamindar, a landowner. He had a dispute with our commanders. The company wanted to eliminate that man and his village. And you carried out the orders." "Yes. God forgive us, we did." Tears began to flow from Victor's eyes. "We surrounded the village. We locked the doors of the houses, and we set them on fire. I can still hear the screams, Mr. Holmes. Every night I hear them." Martha held Victor's hand. Holmes listened silently. "By morning," Victor continued, "nothing remained of the village, only ashes and bones. But one child had escaped. We saw him running in the darkness. His hands were burned. He had run through the fire. George went after him but couldn't find him." "Was that child James Whitfield?" Victor nodded. "I didn't know it then. But years later, after I returned to England, a man came to me. He wanted a new identity. I saw his hands, burn marks just like that child's, and his eyes. I never forgot those eyes. Eyes lit by fire." Holmes leaned forward. "And you gave him a new identity? Aldous Kincaid?" "Yes, foolish, I know. But I didn't recognize him then. Years had passed, he'd grown up, changed." Victor bowed his head. "Then, a few months ago, George saw him at a meeting in business circles, and he recognized him by his eyes. George came to me in a panic. 'That boy,' he said, 'the boy who ran away that night, here in London. Did George blackmail him?' Victor laughed bitterly. George was always greedy for money. Yes, he went to Kincaid or Whitfield. He asked for money in exchange for silence. He paused. A week later, he was found dead. Watson asked, "Why are you hiding?" "Because I'm next, Dr. Watson. After George died, I received a letter. It contained a single sentence. The fire will be remembered." Victor trembled. "I've been hiding ever since, with Martha's help." Holmes stood up. "Mr. Hale, now tell me what you know about Aldous Kincaid. Where does he live? What does he do? What kind of person is he?" Victor thought. "He lives in a large mansion in Mayfair. He's an investment banker, very wealthy. He's known in society circles, but he's a cold man. He's not close to anyone." "Do you know about his family?" "No. He's single as far as I know, but—" Victor hesitated. "There's a rumor he's interested in the Moran family inheritance. You know that bankrupt family, the one George belongs to. Kincaid is trying to get hold of that inheritance through legal means." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Interesting. If George Moran dies and there are no other heirs, the inheritance goes to the state. And at the state auction—" "Kincaid could buy it," Watson finished. "Yes, but that's only part of it. Revenge is more personal." Holmes turned to Victor. "Mr. Hale, we may need to see you again tomorrow. Please keep hiding and be careful." Victor nodded. "Mr. Holmes, please." "Stop him. That man, he's not human anymore. 30 years of hatred have turned him into a monster." Holmes didn't respond. He just bowed his head and left the bar. Outside, the cold night air brushed their faces. Watson asked, "What do we do now?" "We need to warn Dr. Croft. He's on the list too." Holmes walked with quick steps. "And then, it's time to meet Aldous Kincaid." "Are you going directly?" "Why not? An official visit? A curious detective wants to meet a wealthy businessman." A dangerous smile appeared on Holmes's face. Seeing the enemy up close is the best way to understand his plans. It was past midnight when they arrived at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The hospital was quiet and dark. Only the lights in the emergency room were on. Holmes knew the way to the pathology department well. Dr. Croft's office door was ajar. Light was seeping out from inside. Holmes pushed the door open and entered. The scene he saw confirmed all his suspicions. Dr. Edmund Croft lay motionless behind his desk. His eyes were open, his face frozen in an expression of terror, and there was a deep cut across his throat, just like Samuel Harker. Watson rushed over and checked his pulse. "He's dead, recently. The body hasn't cooled yet." Holmes scanned the room quickly. There was a piece of paper on the desk, a note. "The fire will be remembered," Holmes read. The same message. Watson stood up. The killer was here. Maybe he's still in the building. Holmes rushed to the window. Outside, in the hospital garden, a shadow moved, a figure blending into the darkness. "There!" Holmes leaped from the window. They were on the first floor. The fall wasn't high, and began chasing after the shadow. Watson followed behind. The shadow crossed the hospital garden and darted into the back streets. Holmes was on its heels, his footsteps echoing on the stone pavement. But the shadow was fast, moving as if it knew the darkness, knew the streets. When they turned a corner, Holmes stopped. It was a narrow dead end, and the shadow had vanished. "Damn it," Holmes muttered. Watson came up to him, out of breath. "Did he get away?" "Yes, he knows the area very well." Holmes looked around. "But he may have left a trace." He bent down. There were footprints in the muddy ground, and something glinted, a small piece of metal. Holmes picked it up. It was a button, bronze with a small anchor motif. "Watson, do you recognize this button?" Watson looked at the button. "It's the same as the one we found on the coffin in the grave." "Yes, a sailor's button." Holmes put the button in his pocket. "Our killer also arranged George Moran's fake funeral. This proves he was involved in this business 30 years ago." "But that doesn't make sense. Whitfield was just a child then. How could he have arranged a fake funeral?" Holmes shook his head thoughtfully. "True, Watson. That means either he has an accomplice or there's someone else in the story we don't know about." When they returned to the hospital, the police had already arrived. Lestrade looked irritable and tired as usual. "Holmes, what is this? 2 murders in one day, and both connected to your investigation." "3, Lestrade. Samuel Harker, Dr. Croft, and probably a 3rd soon." Holmes looked serious. "The last name on the killer's list is Victor Hale. You must put him under protection." Lestrade frowned. "You owe me an explanation, Holmes." Holmes took a deep breath and told the whole story. The village in Bengal, the fake identity operation, the 30-year vendetta. Lestrade's face drained as he listened. "Good heavens," he said finally. This is a nightmare." "Yes, Lestrade, and the nightmare isn't over yet." Holmes looked out of the window. Dawn was breaking, a grey light spreading over London. "The killer will strike again, and this time we'll stop him." By morning, Holmes and Watson had returned to Baker Street. Both were exhausted, but sleep was unthinkable. Holmes spread all the evidence he had gathered on the table. The ring, the coded paper, the notebook, the picture, the buttons, and the report he had obtained from the India office. "Watson, let's summarize what we know." Holmes lit his pipe. In 1865, a village in Bengal was burned down. Those responsible: George Moran, Victor Hale, and Edward Croft, Dr. Edmund Croft's father. 1 child survived, with burn marks on his hands. Watson nodded. That child grew up, came to England, and took the identity of Aldous Kincaid. Yes, and he waited 30 years. Then he acted. Holmes exhaled smoke. George Moran recognized him and tried to blackmail him. Whitfield, or Kincaid, killed him. Then Dr. Croft. And Victor Hale is next. Absolutely, but... Holmes paused. Something still doesn't add up, Watson. The buttons. The buttons? The buttons we found in the grave and at the murder scene are the same. But in 1865, Whitfield was just a child. He couldn't have arranged George Moran's fake funeral. Holmes stood up. That means either someone helped him or... Holmes's eyes lit up. Or Whitfield has a past we don't know about. Maybe he wasn't the only one who fled that village. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered. "Mr. Holmes, you have a visitor." He introduced himself as Aldous Kincaid. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. "Show him in," Holmes said calmly. The man who entered the room was different from what Holmes had imagined. He was tall, elegantly dressed, and appeared to be in his 50s. His face was regular and expressionless, the cold professionalism of a businessman. But his hands were gloved. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a smooth voice, "we finally meet." Chapter 4. Burn marks. Aldous Kincaid sat down in the chair opposite Holmes. His movements were measured and elegant, the manner of someone who had moved in high society for years. Watson stood by the door, watching the man intently. "Would you like some tea, Mr. Kincaid?" asked Holmes as if entertaining an ordinary guest. "No, thank you. This visit will not be long." Kincaid placed his gloved hands on his knees. "I have brought you an offer, Mr. Holmes." "Really? I'm listening." "I want you to withdraw from the Samuel Harker case. In return," Kincaid smiled slightly, "I'm prepared to pay a generous sum, let's say £5,000. Holmes raised his eyebrows. "That's a lot of money for the death of a dock worker. Why are you so interested?" "For my reputation in business circles." Kincaid shrugged. "Samuel Harker used to handle some of my affairs. I don't want to be associated with his death." "I see. What about Dr. Edmund Croft? Did you have business dealings with him too?" For a moment, just a moment, something stirred on Kincaid's face, but it vanished immediately. "Dr. Croft? I don't know him." "Really? Because he was murdered last night, the same way as Samuel Harker. His throat was slit." Kincaid didn't move. "What an unfortunate coincidence." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes locked with Kincaid's. "Mr. Kincaid, or should I call you James Whitfield?" Silence. Kincaid's face didn't change, but his hands tensed slightly on his knees. "What do you mean?" "In 1867, you acquired a false identity from Victor Hale's printing shop. The real Aldous Kincaid had long since died, in a suspicious boating accident. You bought his identity and have lived under that name ever since." Holmes smiled. "But your real name is James Whitfield, and in 1865 you were in Bengal when a village was burned down." Kincaid stared at Holmes for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a cold, dry laugh. "Impressive, Mr. Holmes. Truly impressive." He stood up and walked to the window. "So, what will you do now? Call the police?" "That depends on your answers." Kincaid turned. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What happened that night? Why did you wait 30 years? And—" Holmes paused. "Are you alone?" Kincaid thought for a moment. Then he began to remove his gloves. Slowly, ceremoniously. His hands were horrific. Burn marks stretched from his fingers to his wrists. The skin was curled and hardened like melted wax. Some fingers had no nails. "Do you see these, Mr. Holmes?" said Kincaid, a note of pain in his voice. "I look at them every day, every night. When I try to sleep, I relive that night." Watson's face had gone pale. Holmes appeared calm, but something in his eyes had changed. "Tell me," he said quietly. Kincaid looked out of the window. "I was 10 years old. Our village was small, maybe 100 people. Farmers, craftsmen, families." His voice drifted away, going back 30 years. "That night, the British soldiers came. There was no warning. They surrounded our houses, nailed the doors shut, and set them on fire." "How did you escape?" My mother pushed me out the window, but the flames were everywhere. My hands burned, my arms burned, but I ran. I kept running." Kincaid turned. His eyes were wet, but his face was stony. "Behind me, I heard my family screaming. My brothers, my mother, my father, everyone." Holmes listened quietly. "I hid in the forest for days. Then a merchant caravan found me. They tended my wounds and took me to the city." Kincaid put his gloves back on. "I begged, I stole, I survived for years. And every day I remembered the faces of those 3 men. I swore I would find them and kill them." "And you did?" "Yes. It took years, but I did. I came to England, followed their trail. I discovered Victor Hale's printing press and made a plan." Kincaid laughed bitterly. "I bought a fake identity from my own killers. How ironic, isn't it? Watson stepped forward. So why did you wait 30 years? Because I didn't just want to kill them, Dr. Watson. I wanted them to suffer too. I worked for years, became rich, became powerful, and I watched them. George's debts, Victor's fears, Edward's guilt. Kincaid turned to Holmes. I learned what each of them valued most, and I took those things away from them. George's money, Holmes said thoughtfully. Victor's security, Edward's or his son's profession and reputation. And then their lives. Kincaid nodded. George was easy. His greed brought him to me. He tried to blackmail me, so I sent him to the Thames. You paralyzed him with poison. Yes, an extract from a plant I brought back from India. It paralyzes the victim but leaves them conscious. George felt everything, saw everything as his throat was cut. But he couldn't move, couldn't scream. A dark satisfaction flashed in Kincaid's eyes. It wasn't a fitting end for my family, but it was enough. Holmes stood up. Mr. Kincaid, you are confessing to murder to me right now. Are you aware of that? Of course. Kincaid appeared calm. But you can't prove it. There are no witnesses, no physical evidence, only your word, and I am a respectable businessman. Watson lunged forward in anger. You're a murderer. I'm a survivor, Dr. Watson. Kincaid's voice hardened. You didn't see that night. You didn't watch your family, your children, your babies burn to death. Those men, George, Victor, Edward, did that. And they faced no punishment. They lived comfortably for 30 years. He paused. Now tell me, is that justice? Holmes thought for a moment. No, he said finally. What they did was not justice, but neither was what you did. Then what is justice, Mr. Holmes? The courts. They would never have been tried. The laws? The laws protect the powerful. Kincaid walked to the door. I made you an offer, and you refused. Now I'll make you another. Drop your investigation, or else... Or else what? Kincaid turned. A cold smile played on his lips. Or else I may have to add another name to my list. He opened the door and walked out. Holmes and Watson were silent for a long time. Holmes, Watson finally said, this man, isn't he mad? No, Watson, he's not mad. Worse, he is logical. Holmes walked to the window and watched Kincaid's car drive away. 30 years of hatred have turned him into a cold, calculating killer. He's planned every step, thought through every detail. Can't we stop him? Not without evidence, and he's very careful not to leave any. Holmes took a deep breath. But he made a mistake. What mistake? He came to us. He made an offer. Holmes smiled. That means he's scared. Maybe he can't control everything as well as he planned. Victor Hale is still alive. Yes, and Kincaid wants to kill him too. But we're on the right track. Holmes picked up his coat. We must get Victor under protection. Then we'll find a way to lure Kincaid into his own trap. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson returned to Martha Stride's bar. Victor Hale was still hiding there, but now under Scotland Yard protection. Lestrade had posted 2 officers outside the door. Holmes, said Victor, rising when he saw them. I heard Kincaid speaking to you. What did he say? He confessed everything, but left no evidence. Holmes sat down opposite him. Mr. Hale, I'm going to ask you for something important now. You need to help us catch Kincaid. Victor's face fell. How can I help? That man is like a ghost. I've known him for 30 years, but I've never been able to get close to him. Perhaps that could be to our advantage. Holmes looked thoughtful. Kincaid wants to kill you, We know that. But if we wait for him... Watson understood. You want to set a trap? Yes. Victor will be the bait. We will wait. Holmes turned to Victor. It's a dangerous plan, I won't deny it. But I see no other way. Victor thought for a long time. His hands were shaking, his face sweaty. But finally, he nodded. I accept, he whispered. I've lived with the guilt of that night for 30 years. Maybe this will help me pay my debt. Holmes bowed his head. Your courage is admirable, Mr. Hale. Martha Stride stepped forward. I'll help too. This is my bar. Whatever happens here, I accept responsibility. Holmes stood up. Thank you. Now we must prepare the plan. As night fell, the Anchor and Hope bar was cleared. Martha had told the customers the bar would be closed for the night. Inside were only Holmes, Watson, Victor, Martha, and 2 plainclothes policemen hiding in the back room. Holmes had examined every corner of the Tew bar, the back door, the windows, the ceiling. He had assessed every possible entry point. If Kincaid comes here, said Holmes, he'll probably come in through the back door. He'll be quiet and quick. He handed Watson a pistol. You might need this tonight, old friend. Watson took the gun. Hope I won't have to use it. Victor sat behind the bar counter, a visible target. Holmes and Watson were hidden in dark corners. Hours passed. It was past midnight. Outside, sounds could be heard occasionally on the streets of Whitechapel. Drunken songs, the wheels of a carriage, a dog barking in the distance. But the bar was silent. When the clock struck 1, Holmes noticed something. There was a very faint smell in the air, sweet and chemical. He recognized it immediately. Gas, he shouted. Everyone out. But it was too late. A thin smoke was seeping under the windows. Holmes ran to the door, but it was locked from the outside. He turned to the back door. It was locked too. Damn it! Holmes tried to break the window, but the panes were covered with wooden frames. He's locked us in. The smoke was thickening. Watson began to cough. Victor collapsed to the floor. Holmes, said Watson, his voice weakening. This opium smoke. Holmes wet his handkerchief and pressed it to his face. Everyone down. The smoke rises. As he lay down, he heard a sound from above, from the ceiling. Footsteps. Then a hatch opened in the middle of the ceiling. A figure leapt down, clad in black, face masked. Kincaid. Mr. Holmes, said Kincaid, his voice mocking. Your plan was admirable, but I've been planning this for 30 years. Your one day of preparation won't suffice. Holmes tried to stand, but his head was spinning. The opium smoke was taking effect. Kincaid walked toward Victor. A long, thin knife glinted in his hand. The last name on the list, Victor. Finally. Stop! Holmes staggered. If you kill him, you won't escape. I have no intention of escaping, Mr. Holmes. Kincaid turned. Tonight, everything ends. Victor, you and your friend, you'll all burn in this bar, just like my village burned. Watson tried to raise his gun, but his fingers were limp. The gun fell from his hand. Holmes threw himself at Kincaid with his last ounce of strength. They both rolled to the floor. The knife flashed in the air, grazing Holmes's arm. But Holmes grabbed Kincaid's wrist and twisted it. Let go! Kincaid groaned. The two wrestled. The smoke was thickening, making it hard to breathe. Holmes's eyes were burning. His lungs felt like fire. Then a crash. The back door was broken. Lestrade and his men burst in. Everyone down. Police! Kincaid pushed Holmes and stood up. He hesitated for a moment. Could he escape? But the exits were blocked. "This isn't over," said Kincaid, raising his hands. "It will never be over." Holmes, lying on the floor, watched as Kincaid was handcuffed. Then darkness fell. When he awoke, he was in his room on Baker Street. Watson was sitting beside his bed. How long have I been here?" Holmes asked, his voice low. 2 days. Watson smiled. "The opium smoke really got to you. But you'll be fine." Holmes tried to sit up. "Kincaid? He's been arrested. He's in Newgate Prison." Watson took a deep breath. "But Holmes, there's a problem." "What problem?" "Kincaid confessed to everything. The murders of George Moran and Dr. Croft. But," Watson paused, "he also described the massacre in Bengal. The newspapers published it. Now all of London knows what the East India Company did." Holmes leaned back on the bed. "And the government is under pressure. Some officials want Kincaid pardoned, or at least his sentence reduced. Justified revenge, they say." Holmes stared thoughtfully at the ceiling. "Justice is a complicated thing, Watson. Kincaid is guilty. There's no doubt about that. But his victims were also guilty. So who will judge whom?" Watson didn't answer. Some questions had no answers. A week later, Holmes had recovered. Lestrade invited him to Newgate for a pre-trial meeting. In his cell, Kincaid appeared calm. He had removed his gloves, his burned hands exposed like a badge. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I'm surprised you came to visit me. I have a question for you." Holmes stood in front of the bars. "That night at the bar, why didn't you just kill Victor? Why did you involve us?" Kincaid thought. "Because you got in the way, and I can't stand obstacles." "One more thing," said Holmes. "The buttons in the grave from George Moran's fake funeral. You were just a child then. Who helped you?" A shadow crossed Kincaid's face. For the first time, he hesitated. "I wasn't alone," he said finally. "I was never alone." "Who?" But Kincaid fell silent. He closed his eyes and turned his head away. Holmes turned and left the cell. He had new questions in his mind, and still no answers. Chapter 5. Shadows and Mirrors. A week after Kincaid's arrest, London was still talking about the incident. Newspapers had splashed the Bengal massacre across their front pages, exposing the East India Company's past atrocities. There were heated debates in Parliament, and the public was protesting. Holmes was looking out the window in his Baker Street room. He had recovered, but his mind was restless. Kincaid's last words, "I wasn't alone," wouldn't leave his mind. When Watson entered, he found Holmes in this state. "Still thinking?" Watson asked, sitting down in his chair. "Yes, Watson. Something is missing." Holmes turned. "Kincaid had a partner, perhaps still does. The buttons in the grave prove it. But who? Maybe he's bluffing, trying to lead you astray. Possible, but Kincaid isn't the type to bluff. He carefully crafts his plans and uses the truth as a weapon." Holmes lit his pipe. "No, Watson, there is a partner, and I need to find him." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson handed him an envelope. "This arrived this morning, Mr. Holmes. It says urgent." Holmes took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few lines written by hand. "Mr. Holmes, I'll be waiting for you tomorrow night at 9 o'clock at King's Cross train station. Platform 9, last carriage. Come alone. I want to give you information about Kincaid's partner, a friend." Watson read the letter. This could be a trap. It certainly could. Holmes folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "But I have to take the risk. If there really is information, you won't go alone, Watson said firmly. I'll come too. Holmes smiled. I expected that, old friend, but the letter says, come alone. Then I'll come secretly. I'll watch you from a distance. Watson stood up. There's no arguing about this, Holmes. Holmes thought for a moment, then shook his head. Very well, but be careful and bring your gun. The next night, King's Cross train station was crowded. Evening trains were departing, passengers rushing about the platforms. The clatter of steam engines, the sound of whistles, and the chatter of people created a huge cacophony. Holmes walked toward platform 9. Watson followed behind, hidden in the crowd. The last carriage stood apart from the others in a dark corner. As Holmes approached, he saw the carriage door was ajar. Inside, a dim light was burning. He opened the door and stepped inside. The carriage was empty, almost. A single woman sat in the seat by the window. Holmes stopped when he saw her. Agnes Moran. Mrs. Moran, said Holmes in surprise. Did you write the letter? Agnes raised her head. Her face was pale, her eyes red, as if she had been crying for days. Yes, Mr. Holmes, I did. Her voice was weary and sorrowful. Sit down, please. I have much to tell you. Holmes sat down in the seat, opposite her, alert and attentive. First, I must ask you a question, he said. Are you Kincaid's partner? Agnes did not answer for a long time. Then slowly she shook her head. Yes, I was his partner, but not in the way you think. She took a deep breath. I'll tell you everything, Mr. Holmes, from beginning to end. My real name isn't Agnes. My name was Priya Sharma. I was born in Bengal, grew up in that village. Agnes, Priya, closed her eyes. That night, when the fire broke out, I was 12 years old. Holmes's eyes widened. Are you one of the survivors? Yes. James, the man you call Kincaid, he's my brother. Priya opened her eyes. Actually, my stepbrother. We had different mothers but the same father. That night we both ran away, in different directions. So how are you here in London, living as a seamstress? It's a long story. Priya looked out the window. After I escaped, I walked for days. I found a missionary school. They took me in. I learned English. I learned to sew. Years later, an English family brought me to London as a maid. And you found your brother. Yes, but it took years. James had also come to England, but by a different route. Back then, we were both poor. We had no one. Priya's voice trembled. But James had changed. He hadn't forgotten that night. Not for a moment. Every day, every night, he thought about revenge. Holmes leaned forward. And you helped him? Priya bowed her head. Yes, at first we just wanted to find them, George Moran, Victor Hale, Edward Croft, to learn who they were, where they lived. But James wanted more. George Moran's fake funeral, did you arrange that? No, James arranged it, but I helped. Priya wiped her eyes. George had decided to flee in 1865. His crimes in India were about to be exposed, and he was afraid. James saw this as an opportunity. If George died, no one would look for him, and years later, James could find him and kill him for real. So George's fake death was part of a long-term plan. Yes, James waited 30 years. He became rich, powerful, and I followed his trail here in Whitechapel. George recognized me as his sister, because that's what I told him. I lived with him for years, watching him. Holmes stood up. But why are you telling me this now? Your brother is in prison. You're an accomplice. Priya raised her head. There was pain and determination in her eyes. Because enough is enough, Mr. Holmes. I lived with hatred for 30 years. I thought revenge would set us free. But revenge chained us even more. She stood up. James is in prison now, and he's not happy. I'm free, but I'm not at peace. Those 3 men are dead, but my family hasn't come back. So what do you want now? I want the truth to be known, the whole truth. Priya pulled a stack of papers from her pocket. These are the records James and I kept. Everything is here, the details of the Bengal massacre, the names of the survivors, the plan for revenge, the murders, everything. Holmes took the papers. If you give these to the police, you'll go to prison too. I know. Priya smiled, a tired, bitter smile. But I'm tired of hiding, Mr. Holmes. I've been living like a shadow for 30 years. I want to die as Priya Sharma now, not as Agnes Moran. The door opened. Watson entered, gun drawn. But Holmes raised his hand. It's all right, Watson. Mrs. Moran, Mrs. Sharma, has come to surrender. Watson stopped, stunned. Priya turned to him. I'm sorry, Dr. Watson. I lied to you too. The man I introduced as my brother wasn't my real brother, at least not by blood. But we shared our pain. We shared our hatred. That made us closer than family. Watson lowered his gun. What happens now? Holmes reviewed the papers. These documents could change everything. The Bengal massacre wasn't just the fault of those 3 men. The orders came from higher up, from the top management of the East India Company. Yes, said Priya. James researched it for years. The real culprits were never punished. George, Victor, and Edward were just pawns. Holmes took a deep breath. These documents could be used in court. They complicate Kincaid's case. I know, but the truth must remain the truth. People need to know what happened. Priya walked to the door. Now, will you take me to Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes? I don't want to run any more. Lestrade listened to Priya Sharma's statement in astonishment. Papers, files, documents, everything was piled on his desk. This is incredible, said Lestrade, scratching his head. A 30-year conspiracy. 2 survivors, a plan for revenge, 3 murders. And more, said Holmes. These documents show that responsibility for the Bengal massacre lies not with just 3 soldiers, but with an entire system. The directors of the East India Company, certain officials in the India office. Lestrade frowned. Holmes, this is huge. The government will try to cover it up. Let them try. The documents are now with you and me. The press will be interested too. Holmes stood up. My work is done, Lestrade. The rest is up to justice. As they went outside, Priya turned to Holmes. Mr. Holmes, I want to ask you something. Her voice was a whisper. Did you understand us? James and me? Why we did it? Holmes paused for a moment. Understanding is one thing. Approving is another, Ms. Sharma. I don't approve of what you did. Murder is never justified. But I understand your pain. And I also understand that what happened that night in that village must be accounted for. Priya closed her eyes. Thank you. That means something to me. Holmes bowed his head and left. On the way back to Baker Street, Watson asked, Holmes, do you think justice was served in this case? Holmes thought for a long time. The streets of London were dark, gas lamps casting a flickering light. In the distance, a church bell struck midnight. Justice, Holmes said finally. Justice is a complex concept, Watson. George Moran, Victor Hale, and Edward Croft were guilty, and they were punished. But those who punished them were also guilty. And the system that punished them, the system was also guilty. So what's the outcome? The outcome is uncertain. Holmes paused and looked up at the sky. Stars were visible through the clouds. Perhaps justice is not an end but a process. Perhaps what matters is to keep searching for the truth, even if we never reach the outcome. Watson nodded thoughtfully. "You're being philosophical tonight." Holmes laughed. "Must be the opium smoke. I'll be back to normal tomorrow." The two continued walking through the dark streets. The lights of Baker Street awaited them in the distance. The following week, the trial began. Aldous Kincaid, or James Whitfield, sat in the dock. Beside him, in a separate chair, was Priya Sharma. Both appeared calm, like the silence after the storm. Holmes was called as a witness. He recounted everything he knew, from the body in the Thames, to the empty grave in Highgate, to the documents at the India Office, to the confession at King's Cross. The prosecutor asked tough questions. The defence attorney argued Kincaid's justifiable revenge argument. The jury seemed undecided. But the real turning point came with the presentation of the India Office documents. The details of the Bengal massacre were read aloud in the courtroom. The jurors paled as they listened. Angry murmurs rose from the spectators. Finally, the judge announced his verdict. Aldous Kincaid was convicted of first-degree murder, but the sentence was set at life imprisonment instead of death. Exceptional circumstances had been taken into account. Priya Sharma received a 5-year prison sentence for complicity and use of a false identity. As the courtroom emptied, Holmes locked eyes with Kincaid one last time. There was neither anger nor remorse on Kincaid's face, only exhaustion, the exhaustion of a 30-year battle. "Is it over, Holmes?" Watson asked as they stepped outside. "No, Watson. This is merely the end of a chapter." Holmes pulled a newspaper from his pocket. The headline read, "Bengal Massacre, Parliament Launches Inquiry." The real story begins now. The crimes of the East India Company can no longer be hidden, and perhaps, just perhaps, this will help prevent future tragedies. Watson nodded. "Let's hope so." That night on Baker Street, Holmes and Watson sat in front of the fireplace. The fire crackled, filling the room with a warm light. "Holmes," Watson said after a while, "has this case affected you? I mean, personally?" Holmes lit his pipe and took a deep drag. "Yes, Watson, it has." He watched the smoke. "I am a man who works with logic and evidence. Emotions can be an obstacle in my profession. But this case reminded me that emotions also have a truth to them." "What do you mean?" "Kincaid, James Whitfield, was he a bad man? He committed murder, yes. But why did he do it? Because his family was murdered. Because the justice system failed him. Because—" Holmes paused. "Because the world is sometimes very unjust, Watson. And in the face of that injustice, some people break, and some try to create their own justice." Watson looked thoughtful. "Are you forgiving him?" "No. Murder is unforgivable, but I understand him." Holmes looked out the window. Outside, the lights of London sparkled. "And that understanding makes me a better detective. Because to catch criminals, I need to think like them. I need to understand their motivations, their fears, their hopes." "That must be difficult." "Yes, but someone has to do it." Holmes smiled. "And I'm quite good at it." Watson laughed. "Modesty is as ever in its place." "Modesty, Watson, is not an excuse to hide the truth." Holmes put down his pipe. Now, shall we move on to the next case? There was an interesting letter in the Morning Post, a missing diamond and a suspicious count. Don't you need to rest? Rest? Holmes stood up. Watson, the mind rusts. Work sharpens it, and my mind wants to be very sharp right now. Watson nodded and stood up. Then let's begin. The two took their first steps toward a new adventure. Outside, the London night awaited them, filled with mysteries, dangers, and unanswered questions. Chapter 6. The final page. On the day of the trial, an unexpected sun rose over London. After gloomy autumn days, the sky was clear blue, as if even the city understood the importance of this day, as if even nature wanted to bear witness. The birds chirped more cheerfully than usual. Street vendors raised their voices, and the people, thousands of Londoners, flowed towards the Old Bailey as if responding to an invisible call. Old Bailey, London's famous criminal court, was crowded from the early hours of the morning. In front of the building, horse-drawn carriages were lined up in rows. Journalists, notebooks in hand, were rushing up and down the stairs. Curious onlookers jostled to get the best spot. Lawyers, their black robes billowing, entered with serious expressions. This was no ordinary trial. Everyone knew that. This was the Bengal massacre trial, the trial of a 30-year-old secret, a 30-year-old revenge, a 30-year-old pain. Holmes and Watson sat in the back rows of the courtroom. With its wooden benches, high ceiling, and narrow windows, the room resembled a centuries-old temple of justice. Portraits of former judges hung on the walls, serious-faced, wigged men, as if telling future generations, "We were here too, we judged too." Before them, in the defendant's chair, stood Aldous Kincaid, or, by his real name, James Whitfield. He had removed his gloves, his burned hands exposed for all to see. Those hands were the strongest evidence in this case, stronger than words, documents, or testimonies. There was no fear on his face, no remorse, only a calm acceptance, like the sea after a storm, still and deep. His eyes scanned the room, meeting Holmes for a moment. A silent understanding passed between them. Not enemies, just two men standing on different sides of the story. In the chair next to him, in a separate section, sat Priya Sharma. The identity of Agnes Moran was now behind her. That name would never be mentioned again in this courtroom. Now she was here, with her real name, her real story. Her face was pale, but her posture was upright, the posture of someone who had finally laid down the invisible burden she had carried on her back for years. Her hands were clasped in her lap. She glanced at James from time to time, her brother, her companion, her accomplice. The final act of a 30-year bond was being played out. The judge was an old, dignified man. He was over 60, his face lined, his eyes full of decades of experience. His glasses were perched on the tip of his nose, and he held a thick file in his hand. This file had grown over weeks. Statements, reports, documents, maps. A long trail from Rampura to the Thames. The judge looked around the courtroom and demanded silence. The murmur slowly died away. Coughs, whispers, the rustling of papers, all ceased. The courtroom held its breath. Aldous Kincaid, or James Whitfield, you are charged with the murder of George Moran, known as Samuel Harker. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, a heavy, measured, emotionless voice, the voice of justice. You also face charges of assault on Dr. Edmund Croft and attempted murder of Victor Hale. The judge paused. He looked at Kincaid over his glasses. "Do you accept these charges?" Kincaid stood up. His movement was slow but determined. All eyes in the courtroom were on him. Hundreds of eyes, hundreds of questions, hundreds of judgments. But he didn't care about any of them. He only looked at the judge, directly, fearlessly. "Yes," he said, his voice clear and resolute. There was no hesitation, no evasion. "I killed George Moran, and if I had had the chance, I would have killed Victor Hale too." A murmur rose through the courtroom. Whispers, stunned looks, heads turning. Reporters scribbled frantically. The judge banged his gavel, a sharp, sharp sound. "Silence," Kincaid continued without waiting for the judge's permission. His voice carried to every corner of the courtroom. "But there's something the court needs to know. I am a murderer, yes. I don't deny it, and I won't. But my victims were murderers too, and their crimes were much, much greater than mine." The prosecutor stood up, nervously, anxiously. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is trying to divert the case. The victim's past is not on trial here." The judge thought. A long, heavy silence. The entire courtroom waited for his decision. "Objection overruled." The judge's voice was calm but firm. "This case involves extraordinary circumstances. I will allow the defendant to speak, but only on matters relevant to the case. The jury will decide for itself what is relevant and what is not." Kincaid bowed his head. It was unclear whether out of respect or mockery. Then he turned to the courtroom and began to speak. Kincaid's story lasted an hour in the courtroom. Silence filled the air with his voice. Occasionally, a cough, a sob, a sigh could be heard, but no one spoke, no one interrupted. He described Rampura village, a small village nestled in the heart of Bengal, by the riverbank, under the shade of mango trees. He described the houses, mud walls, thatched roofs, children playing in the courtyards. He described the fields, rice paddies, golden ears of corn swaying in the wind. He described the temple, the small temple in the heart of the village, its bells ringing morning and evening, its walls decorated with flowers. He described his family, his father, a respected farmer in the village, a man with calloused hands, but a soft heart. He described his mother, a woman who rose at dawn every morning, sang songs to her children, and told stories by the fire in the evenings. He described his siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, all younger than him, all looking to him for protection. He described a normal life, the life of a child who woke up in the morning, ate dinner in the evening, and gazed at the stars at night. He described an ordinary happiness, the festivals, the weddings, the harvest times. He described the last days lived without knowing. Then he described that night. "The sun had set," he said, his voice drifting into the distance. His eyes no longer saw the courtroom. They saw 30 years ago. "We were having dinner. My mother had cooked rice, as always with spices, with love. My father had brought vegetables from the garden, fresh, smelling of soil. My siblings, my younger siblings, were fighting, as always, over something trivial. Who would get more food, who would get a better seat. My mother was scolding them. My father was laughing. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. Even the journalists' pens stopped. The jurors leaned forward in their chairs. Then we heard sounds, the sound of horses, the sound of commands, shouting in English. My father went outside. "I'll take a look," he said. "You stay inside." And he never came back. Kincaid paused. He took a breath, a deep, shaky breath. They nailed the doors of the houses shut from the outside. I heard it, the sound of hammers, the crackling of wood. My mother gathered us up, hid us in a corner. "Be quiet," she said. "Be quiet and pray." Then they started the fire. Every house, one by one. I looked out the window. Flames everywhere, smoke everywhere. The sky was orange. People were screaming, trying to break down the doors. But the doors wouldn't open. Soldiers were waiting outside, pushing back those who tried to escape. One of the jurors turned his head away. He couldn't watch. A woman wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. My mother pushed me out of the window. I remember her last words, "Run, run, and don't stop. Don't look back." I fell, I rolled. Flames were everywhere. I burned my hands, I burned my arms. I remember the pain, the burning, the scorching, the melting skin. But I ran, and I didn't look back. Kincaid raised his hands, burned, deformed, ugly hands. He showed them to the jury, showed them to the courtroom. These hands are the scars of that night. I look at them every day. Every day I remember that night. Every day I hear my mother's last words. Then he looked at the courtroom, at the jury, at the judge. There were no tears in his eyes. They had long since dried. Only cold, sharp determination. Judge me, convict me. I deserve it because I committed murder. But know this too. George Moran, Victor Hale, and Edward Croft killed 110 people. Women, children, babies. They wiped out a village, and they faced no punishment. For 30 years they lived comfortably, laughed, breathed, were happy. Kincaid sat down. His back was straight, his head held high. A long silence fell over the courtroom, heavy, suffocating, almost sacred. Then Victor Hale testified. When Victor stepped onto the witness stand, his legs trembled. His face was ashen, dark, circles under his eyes. His hands clenched the edge of the stand as if trying to hold on. He carried the weight of 30 years of guilt, 30 years of fear. And now he had to bear that weight in front of everyone. "State your name and occupation," said the prosecutor. Victor swallowed. His voice seemed stuck in his throat. "Victor Hale," he paused. Retired soldier." "Mr. Hale, did you serve in India in 1865? "Yes." "Did you participate in the operation in Rampura village?" Victor's eyes drifted for a moment to Kincaid, the man sitting silently in the defendant's chair. 30 years ago, a child fleeing in the dark. Now, the man judging him. Life's strange cycles. "Yes," he said finally. "I did." "What happened that night?" And Victor told them. He told them everything, without holding anything back. The orders, the planning, the encirclement of the village, locking the doors, starting the fire, listening to the screams. His voice trembled, broke, faltered at times. But he continued, because now was not the time to stop. Now was the time for truth. "I gave the order," he said, his voice breaking. "Set it on fire," I said. George hesitated. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. But I insisted. I was a murderer. The courtroom murmured again, but this time it was a lower, more sorrowful murmur. The judge banged his gavel, but this time more slowly, more wearily. Victor continued. "I lived with this crime for 30 years. Every night I heard those screams. I ran, I hid, I lied. I used different names, I moved to different cities. But the guilt never ended. Wherever I went, it came with me." The defense attorney stood up. "Mr. Hale, did you know the family of my client, James Whitfield, Aldous Kincaid?" Victor thought. His memory went back 30 years, to a smoky, bloody, chaotic night. "No, that night I didn't see faces, only Only flames, only shadows, not people, targets. Did you see a child running away that night? Victor's face changed. For a moment, just a moment, he was back there. Yes, he whispered. I saw a child. He was running through the flames. His hands were burning, the fire was melting his skin. But he was running. There was something unstoppable about him. George went after him but couldn't find him. The darkness swallowed him. Do you know that child is here now? Victor looked at Kincaid. The two men, 30 years later, facing each other in a courtroom. One the defendant, one the witness, one the killer, one the victim. Or perhaps both killers, both victims. Yes, said Victor. His eyes were filled with tears. I know. Finally, Priya Sharma testified. When Priya took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed once more. This was a different kind of witness, neither fully defendant, nor fully victim, nor fully innocent. Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none of them. Your name? Priya Sharma. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. I was known as Agnes Moran in London. I used that name for 30 years. You are also from Rampura village? Yes, James Whitfield, now known as Kincaid, is my stepbrother. Same father, different mothers. The courtroom buzzed once more. This information was new. The newspapers didn't know it, the gossips didn't know it. Pens moved frantically. Priya told her story. That night, the flames, the smoke, the screams, the escape, running in the dark, falling, getting up, running again. Losing James at a crossroads, a moment's hesitation, losing each other, the years of searching in India, then England, street by street, city by city. I found James in London, she said. But he wasn't James anymore. He was Aldous Kincaid, rich, powerful, cold. The child inside him was dead. All that was left was vengeance. And you helped him? Yes. Priya didn't deny it. I found George Moran. I got close to him. I became his sister. I watched him for years, where he lived, what he did, who he met. I reported everything to James. Do you regret it? Priya thought. The room waited, a long, heavy silence. I don't know, she said finally. Her voice was sincere and weary. I lost my family. I lost my childhood. I lost my identity. I lived with hatred and pain for 30 years. Do I regret it? Maybe. But at the same time, what else could I have done? Tell me, what else could I have done? No one answered, because there was no answer. The jury debated for 4 hours to reach a verdict. Those 4 hours passed slowly for Holmes and Watson. They waited outside the courthouse, on the stone steps beside the iron railings. The sun was beginning to set, that magnificent blue sky now turning shades of orange and pink. London's skyline was beginning to darken on the horizon. A new night was approaching. Holmes, Watson said, breaking the silence. What do you think the verdict will be? Holmes thought. A pigeon landed on a nearby bench, cleaning its wings with its beak. A normal movement, a normal moment. Far from the weight of the court, the ordinary flow of life. Conviction, Holmes said finally. Kincaid committed murder, that is undeniable. In the eyes of the law, motivation is irrelevant. Murder is murder. But the sentence may be mitigated. Holmes took a deep breath. The jury heard Rampura. They heard Victor's confession. They heard Kincaid's story. These people are no longer just looking at a murder case. They must be questioning what justice is, what revenge is, what crime and punishment mean. Watson looked thoughtful. And Priya? Priya will also be punished, but probably lightly. Accessory to a crime, use of a false identity. Serious crimes, but not murder. A few years, perhaps, maybe less, with good behavior. Victor? Victor testified. He confessed. But there's no case to try him. Rampura wasn't committed on British soil, and the statute of limitations has long since expired. Holmes sighed. Sometimes the law is different from justice, Watson. Sometimes criminals go unpunished. Sometimes the innocent are punished. The system isn't perfect. It never has been. The courthouse doors opened. A bailiff stepped out, a young, serious-faced man. The jury has reached its verdict. Everyone in. The courtroom was even more crowded than before. People were standing, climbing on the windowsills, peering through the doorways. Everyone wanted to see this moment, the final scene of a 30-year story. The jury foreman stood up. He was an old man with grey hair, a merchant perhaps, or a retired civil servant. He held a piece of paper, the jury's verdict, the summary of 12 people's deliberations, 4 hours of discussion. As a jury, he said, his voice echoing throughout the courtroom, we have reached the following verdict. Everyone held their breath. Time seemed to stand still. First charge, the murder of George Moran, guilty. It was an expected verdict. The courtroom fell silent. Second charge, assault and attempted murder of Victor Hale, guilty. Again, expected. Third charge, assault of Dr. Edmund Croft, guilty. The jury foreman paused. He took a deep breath. Then he continued. However, as a jury, we request that extraordinary circumstances be considered in determining the sentence. His voice rose, loud enough for everyone to hear. The defendant's past, the trauma he has experienced, and the victim's own crimes should be considered mitigating factors. The jury believes that the full sentence would not be fair. A murmur rose in the courtroom. Shock, approval, protest, all at once. It was an unexpected verdict, conviction, but also a plea for mercy. The judge banged his gavel. Silence. I take note of the jury's request. The sentence will be announced within a week. Court is adjourned. A week later, the sentence was announced. Aldous Kincaid, James Whitfield received a life sentence, but not the death penalty. Exceptional circumstances had been taken into account. The jury's request had been accepted by the judge. Priya Sharma received a 5-year prison sentence for complicity and use of false identity. It was not a heavy sentence, but the price of freedom was heavy. Victor Hale faced no charges. He could not be tried legally. But his testimony in court was entered into the official record. The Rampura massacre had now emerged from the dark pages of history and seen the light of day. And perhaps most importantly, Parliament established a commission to investigate the former East India Company operations in Bengal. Newspapers reported on this story for days. Politicians made speeches. The public asked questions. Rampura was no longer a forgotten village. It had taken its place in the pages of history. A month after the trial, Holmes visited Newgate Prison. The prison was a dark and gloomy structure in the heart of London. Its stone walls, iron doors, narrow corridors, everything told those inside. There is no way out. Accompanied by a guard, Holmes walked through the long corridors. Footsteps echoed on the stones. James's cell was deep within the building. A small window, a bunk bed, a table, a chair, that was all. But James seemed to find peace in this simplicity. He had taken off his gloves, his burned hands resting on his knees. There was a strange expression on his face. Peace, acceptance, or just deep exhaustion. Holmes couldn't tell. "Mr. Holmes," said James, seeing him. His voice was calm, soft. "I'm surprised you came." "I'm surprised too." Holmes sat down on the stool in front of the bars. "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." "Are you sorry?" James thought. Long, deeply. His eyes looked at the light streaming through the window, outside, at freedom, at life somewhere. "I don't regret killing George," he said finally. "He burned my family. He was responsible for the deaths of my mother, my father, my siblings. He deserved to die, I still believe that. What about the other things? Spending 30 years seeking revenge?" James smiled, a bitter, weary, yet somehow peaceful smile. "Sometimes I wonder," he said, "if I had let go of revenge, lived a different life, what would have happened? Maybe I could have been happy. Maybe I could have had a family, a wife, children, a home, a normal life, ordinary happiness. But you didn't." "I couldn't." James shook his head. "The hatred was eating me up. Every day, every night, I thought about them, my mother, my father, my siblings. And then them, George, Victor, Edward. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't live. Revenge was my reason for living. Without it, I would have died long ago." Holmes listened silently. The guard's footsteps came and went in the distance. "Now," James continued, "the revenge is over. George is dead," Victor testified. "The world learned the truth. And I'm here." He looked around, at the cold stone walls, the iron bars, the small window. "Strangely, I'm at peace. For the first time in 30 years, I'm at peace. The burden is lifted. Now there's only living left, however long that may be." Holmes stood up. Before leaving, he wanted to say something. "I'll tell you something, James." He used his name for the first time. "I don't condone what you did. Murder is wrong under any circumstances. I believe that. But I understand your pain. And you helped tell Rampura's story. That means something. Perhaps in the end, that matters more." James lifted his head. In his eyes was something he hadn't seen in a long time. Perhaps hope, perhaps gratitude, perhaps just human connection. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. This means something to me." Holmes bowed his head and left the cell. Behind him, James remained, his burned hands, his heavy memories, and perhaps, finally, a little peace. When he returned to Baker Street, Watson was waiting for him. A fire burned in the fireplace, filling the room with a warm light. The curtains were open, and outside, the lights of London sparkled. Outside, life went on. Horse-drawn carriages, people walking, children laughing. "How did it go?" Watson asked. Holmes sat down in his chair. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The tiredness of having completed something. "Interesting," he said. "James, he seemed at peace. Strange, isn't it? In a prison cell with a life sentence, but at peace," Watson thought. "Perhaps it's because the burden is lifted. 30 years of hatred, 30 years of planning. It's all over. Now, there's just being. Perhaps." Holmes looked at the fireplace. The flames danced, orange, yellow, red, hypnotic, soothing. "This case has taught me a great deal, Watson." "Like what?" "The complexity of justice, the emptiness of revenge, the weight of the past." Holmes took a deep breath. "And people. How resilient people are. James suffered a terrible trauma. He lost his family, his childhood, his identity. But he survived. He fought. And in the end, albeit through the wrong means, he made his voice heard." Watson smiled. "You're getting philosophical again." "Perhaps I'm getting old." Holmes smiled too, tired but sincere. "Or maybe this case has affected me. Both could be true." Silence. The crackling of the fireplace. Distant sounds from outside. Two friends sitting before a fireplace, contemplating life. "Holmes," Watson said finally. Can I ask you something? Ask. If you were in James's place, if you had seen his family burned to death, heard those screams, smelled that smoke, what would you have done? Holmes didn't answer for a long time. His eyes continued to stare at the flames. The question was heavy, the kind with no answer. I don't know, he said finally. His voice was low and honest, and I hope I never have to find out. That night, Holmes went to bed early. But before falling asleep, he did something. He took a piece of paper from his desk, thick, cream-coloured, high-quality paper. He took his pen, ink, old, reliable, and he wrote a short letter to James Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, we met in this case and I was against you. I caught you, took you to court, helped get you convicted. It was my duty, I don't deny that. But today, I want to tell you this. Your story has been heard. Rampur will not be forgotten. Your family lives on, not just in your memory, in the pages of history, in newspaper archives, in people's minds. This was not the victory of revenge, but of truth, and perhaps, in the end, that is more important. I wish you peace. Yours. Sincerely, Sherlock Holmes. He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and left it on the table. He would send it tomorrow, to Newgate, to James's cell. Then he lay down on his bed and closed his eyes. Outside, the London night continued. Millions of lights, millions of lives, millions of stories. A mystery in every window, a secret in every street, a burden in every heart. The city never slept, but its people slept, rested, prepared for tomorrow. And Sherlock Holmes, in the heart of this city, ready for new adventures, fell asleep. Epilogue 6 months later. Victor Hale died. Illness. The doctors had diagnosed it before the trial. There was something in his lungs, incurable. Victor knew this. Perhaps that was why he had spoken at the trial, confessed, told everything. It was his last chance, and he had used it. But before he died, he did one thing. He established a memorial fund for Rampura's victims. He donated all his savings, years of savings, the money from the sale of his house, everything. The fund would be used for the education of poor children in India. A small gesture, but a meaningful one. Priya Sharma was released from prison 3 years later. She had received a good behavior reduction. She was a quiet, calm, trouble-free prisoner. When she was released, she left London. No one knew where she went. Perhaps she returned to India. Perhaps she went to another country. Perhaps she started a new life in another corner of London, under a new name. But wherever she went, we can hope she turned over a new leaf. James Whitfield remained at Newgate. Over the years, he calmed down. His anger subsided. His hatred faded. He began reading books, history, philosophy, poetry. He taught other prisoners to read and write, the young ones, the unlucky ones, those who needed a second chance. Once, he told a journalist, "Revenge kept me going for 30 years, but now I'm learning to live without it. It's hard, but not impossible, and perhaps this is a better life." And Rampura. The parliamentary inquiry lasted 2 years. Hundreds of documents were examined. Dozens of witnesses were heard. Thousands of pages of reports were written. Finally, an official statement was made. Most of the rebellion suppression operations in Bengal were actually massacres of civilians. The East India Company had killed innocent people for profit. The government issued an official apology. Late, inadequate, but still an apology. A small step, but a step nonetheless. Holmes watched these developments from afar. Each one reminded him of this case, its complexity, its pain, and perhaps, in the end, a measure of justice. Because justice is not always found in courtrooms. Sometimes it is found in the telling of stories. Sometimes it is found in the uncovering of truths. Sometimes it is found in the hearing of voices, the sharing of pain, the lightening of burdens. And this case, at least, achieved that. The story was over, but its echoes would continue for many years, perhaps forever.